Welcome back to Demystify Sci. I'm Anastasia.
I'm Shiloh.
And today we have a wide-ranging conversation about science, meaning, and metaphysics. For the conversation with us, we have previous guest John Horgan, who in the 1990s wrote a book called The End of Science. And we had a conversation with him probably about 6 months back, maybe a little bit more, where we gave him the opportunity to dig into what he meant when he said that science was over. And in that conversation, I think that we did our best to try to convince John that there's actually a ton of stuff that's left to explore in the world. And I think that he also made a decent case of the fact that the paradigms were kind of cashed out. And so we got a lot out of that conversation. It's been a few months, and I've been following his blog. It's called Crosscheck. It's at johnhorgan.org. And I noticed that he had started to get into this territory about the nature of consciousness and the failures of current theories to find what consciousness is. And also, I discovered a growing cynicism about the medical industrial complex. And both of these things were really interesting to me. And so I figured that we could have him back on for a conversation about what he's been thinking about those things. And what ended up happening is that we basically had a meta conversation about, what would you say, like beliefs, about how to understand the world, about how science can offer meaning. Like, what is the role of postmodernism? Why is everything so postmodernist right now? Is there a way out of it? We ended up talking about a bunch of forbidden topics, which...
Too hot for school. Yeah. We might move the end of this conversation off of YouTube onto the other platforms. We've done that in the past when we get into the dirty words that you're not allowed to say on YouTube and stuff like that. Not curse words, but topics that are off limits. But it's kind of perfect because that's in some sense at the heart of the decision space that we face when it comes to science. Is how do we approach all of this new knowledge without having a moral alignment towards its outcome? So yeah, this is a huge conversation. We're all over the place. I think you guys are gonna love it.
It was really fun though. It was like very lighthearted, and I think John's really fun to talk to because he's just a funny guy. Like, he's always cracking jokes, and
yeah, and he's just so prolific. He's just constantly studying and writing. He's not even, it's not a Substack. He's not making money off this blog. He has a job. He's a professor. He teaches, I believe, is it scientific writing or something along those lines? He's an English professor.
I'm embarrassed to acknowledge that I have no idea.
Yeah,
I know he teaches at Stevens, but I don't know.
It's like a philosophy of science course, but it's through writing. I mean, he's definitely an English professor, but he has a keen interest in science. And so the way that we organize our ideas is at the core of writing, and it's at the core of science too, right? Everybody on the street all my students start out thinking science is just this list of evidence, but the reality is that there's always a narrative that accompanies it. And the proliferation and the strangling of narratives is a wildly epic battle that is playing out at all times. Anyways, this is what we're talking about today. It's awesome. Remember, the show's entirely supported by listeners, so we're not plastering ads across this. We're not selling anybody's goods. We are just supported by people like you who care about what's going on here, and we depend on that. So do consider checking out our Patreon page. And if you do join up for as little as whatever, $1, $3 that you can give a month, you can actually come and hang out with us once a week. We get together face to face and chop it up about all the things that are exciting and worthy of investigation in the world. And I'd love to see you there. And maybe you don't have the money to give today. Maybe you have $1 million. You can give us $1 million. That would be fantastic. Maybe you don't. And if you don't, you might later. So for now, just share the podcast with somebody. That's a great way for you to support us without having to spend a dime. And it means the world to us. The wider we can reach with this project, the better the guests that we can get, and the more time we can put towards making sure these conversations are solid and thick and good. Dense. Is dense a better adjective
solid
for you?
And thick and good. No, it's great. I think that they're all true things about the podcast. So I was just thinking about the way that you said it. It was very amusing. I really value our patrons. The patrons make it possible for us to do what it is that we do. And so to everybody who's already there, thank you. To everybody who's not there, come find us on Facebook, Discord, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, literally any place with a search bar. I think there's comments on Spotify now. You can leave a rating on Apple Podcasts. Anything that you can do to help the world see that what we're producing is interesting and worth paying attention to, that would be fantastic. And with that said, enjoy the conversation with John Horgan, and we will see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
Indeed, this is the Side Podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
Shiley and I were kind of talking back and forth this morning. We were looking over your blog, and we were thinking about what this conversation could be about. And there's kind of two directions that we could take it, and I think that both of the directions are related.
And we're also just interested in what you've been thinking about most recently too. So, I mean, one thing that was kind of, there's two arms that we were interested in. One is this idea of medicine and modern medicine and what's going on there, which we have had a lot of explorations about. The other one was your investigation into the psychedelic experiences of your past with respect to William James's work, which we also read recently, and
just psychedelics and consciousness in general. I think that there's.
Well, I also wanted to say we read. Have you read Olaf Stapledon's Star Maker?
Yeah, it was recommended to me by Freeman Dyson decades ago when I interviewed him, and yeah, so I read it. I mean, we could.
Well, because your psychedelic experience kind of reminded me of that book, actually, the way that you wrote about it in that blog. Anyways, so I was like, oh, this sounds exactly. Well, not exactly, but a very interesting exploration of what it means to journey out of your body through all of the experiences of life from a cosmic perspective, and then kind of realize that isn't that just what people mean by God in some sense? And yeah, I don't know. We could talk about that too. But that book is really fascinating. Yeah.
But I think that the way that they're related, the decay of the medical industrial system and what I take to be kind of the failure of the last 50 years of consciousness research to be able to find the place where consciousness arises, to me kind of seem like two sides of the same coin. And I think ultimately this is also related to this idea of have we reached the end of being able to figure things out? And these two threads wind around that central core, I think, because it's if medicine works, you would expect that every single year we would continue to get better and better and better drugs.
And better health outcomes.
And better health outcomes. And if our theories of consciousness worked, you would expect that we would be able to have something that was able to functionally explain psychedelic experiences, religious experiences, how to build a machine that actually has these things, anesthesia, dreams. And we're not any closer to either one of these things. And when you say that that's the case, people seem to get very upset.
Yeah, I mean, the meta issue here, which is something that I've thought about a lot and I go back and forth on, is whether we're making progress. There are lots of kinds of progress that we could make, having better healthcare, medicine, so that we live longer, healthier lives, a better understanding of ourselves, a better understanding of the universe, more just social, political, and economic systems. And, I've got a kind of negative view of progress of science, but otherwise, I have always thought that, maybe not always, but over the past few decades, I convinced myself that we are making moral progress. We are living in ways in which more people benefit. There is less really kind of blatant, revolting inequality, and so I think that the height of my optimism came under Barack Obama, even though he wasn't all I wanted him to be. And just obviously over the last 8 years, anybody who believes in progress uh, is has been jolted. And so I don't know if I can call my belief in progress of faith, because there's a lot of empirical data you can bring to that issue. But right now, it is very hard to see a future in which we're kind of making incremental progress toward a better world, a more peaceful world, a more just world, a healthier, wealthier world, all that sort of stuff. So that's
So let's unpack that a little bit. So what do you mean when you're experiencing this optimism? You mean that the standard of living across the board has risen such that there's less abject poverty and privation in the world at large, and that's what you're experiencing in 2008?
yeah, that's part of it. Um, and so standards of living have risen dramatically over the last couple hundred years. I Some of my progressive friends hate Steven Pinker, but this is the case that he's made in several books, and I see why they're irritated with him, because his message of optimism, things getting better and better, resonates a little bit too much with Bill Gates and the tech overlords. And so they're going, yeah, our system is really fantastic. Things are getting better and better. But Pinker has the statistics to back that up. There's much less poverty and hunger in the US than there was back in the 1960s, for example. Levels of extreme poverty around the world have dropped. Lifespan has increased pretty steadily over the last 50 years. Democracy has increased a lot over the last 100 years, especially since women got the right to vote about 100 years ago, and in Western so-called democracies. So moral progress, progress in civil rights, progress in rights for people who aren't straight sexually. I mean, I've seen this in my lifetime. I'm a lot older than you guys. When I was a kid, a black person couldn't marry a white person in the state of Virginia. Abortion was illegal. You better not tell anybody that you're gay, because you could really get in trouble.
Like women couldn't have
those-
bank accounts until the 70s, right?
Well,
Yeah,
without the permission of their husband or some other male figure.
Yeah.
They had to
Yeah,
have like a co-signer.
Yeah, I mean, my mom was all her mail was addressed to Mrs. John Horgan. My dad was also a John Horgan. So I like to. Not only that, I moved to New York City in 1980. I'd been living in Denver and moved to New York to finish up college. And the Hudson River was a cesspool then. The sky over Manhattan was just grimy and gray. You'd make your eyes itch often. Our skies are cleaner. Our water is so. There are all these areas in which things have gotten better, but a lot of those trends are dipping lately.
Not to mention like the dark side, like the rise of strange unease and well-being, I guess is the word that comes to mind. It's like how is the well-being in the modern age? You know, you look at the psychological pain of social media, school shootings, like there's these weird phenomena that are developing that have no real precedent that I'm aware of.
Okay, so what's really interesting is that I've argued with my brother about this, and I've always presented the case that people's happiness is less than it used to be, right? Where people feel that there's something wrong with their world more acutely than they did 20 or 30 years ago. But if you look at like Gallup polls for happiness or whatever organization is surveying, happiness has stayed relatively constant. There was a peak in
What
the
about
mid-90s.
loneliness?
That's interesting, and I can take a look at that. But so maybe it's that the happiness is there's some kind of baseline that people respond to it. I did think that it was so the study that I was thinking about was asking people to respond how happy they felt with the general direction and arc of their lives on a scale of 1 to 3, which is a pretty narrow scale to begin with. And so, okay, fine, that's already a weird survey. And they reported the average of all of the results. And so I think that the entire spread of results went from like 2.1 to 2.6 from like the 80s to the present day, with a peak in like 1993, which feels really appropriate because I do feel like 1993 was maybe the high watermark of the wealth and culture and satisfaction with the way that the world worked, and everything went kind of haywire after that. But I'm just I'm not sure that people are actually unhappier. I wonder if it isn't just easier for people to complain about things in a way that's algorithmically amplified. And so we're all kind of stewed in this water of like, man, things suck. Because like, I think about my parents who immigrated from the Soviet Union with 2 kids and my dad's mom into Israel during the Gulf War. And everybody was issued a gas mask. And so like all the kids would go to school with gas masks. My mom had to hermetically seal the interior of the apartment with tape because I was a baby, I was 1, and babies, I wouldn't wear the gas mask, and it freaked me out so badly when everybody else was wearing the gas masks that if they put me in the crib and everybody put their gas masks on when there was an attack, I would just scream the entire time. And so my mom was like, okay, well, we can't wear the gas masks, so I guess we'll just seal the apartment in the hopes that if there is a gas attack, that like we've sealed it well enough that we won't die. And if we do die, I guess we'll all die together. And I'm like, that seems like an order of magnitude worse than anything that anyone is going through right now. And they were just kind of fine with it.
I mean, people weren't shooting up schools though.
There was like a military rocket installation in the courtyard of our apartment building. Like, there was constant fear of the fact that Saddam was going to drop chemical weapons on people. Like, people in the 70s and 80s were terrified of nuclear war in a way that was really viscerally on the edge of their seats. And so I guess here's my thought. I'm like, is it really worse? Or do we just complain more?
I think it's different. But yeah, I'd be curious what John thinks.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up nuclear weapons because when I was in grade school, we did those infamous duck and cover exercises. I can remember being in my elementary school, Fox Run Elementary School in Norwalk, Connecticut, and the teacher is, we're like 7, and the teacher is walking us through what to do if we see a big flash of light outside. Immediately turn away from the windows because the glass is going to blow in at us. Get under your seat as quickly as possible, and then we're all going to go down into the basement of the school where there are a bunch of boxes with crackers in them. So when I was a little kid, I was tormented by nightmares in which I'm wandering through this charred, smoldering landscape after a nuclear attack, just trying to find another living person, trying to find my mom and dad, my brother or sisters, and I'm beginning to realize that there's nobody left. I'm the only person still alive in the entire world. So that was pretty bad. I think you're right that this question, the thing about progress is that there are material ways, empirical ways you can measure it, but when it comes to how we feel about it, I mean, it's a paradox of human life that people who have it all have these fantastic lives, have so many different choices and opportunities, get morbidly depressed. I happen to be been reading, trying to finish Infinite Jest, this gigantic novel by David Foster Wallace, and I'm going to finish the damn thing. I'm already about 80% of the way through, so I'm in the home stretch. And here's a guy who, had affluent parents, had this giant brain, had everything to live for, was acclaimed as a writer, and he took his own life. He was miserable. So there's this disconnect between the material circumstances of our lives and or happiness. It's almost as though, and this is a cliche, but I think it's true, that once we take care of survival, food and shelter, and the basic necessities, we have time to ponder our situation and what it means to be a human being, and where does meaning come from, and is there anybody in charge here? And I like thinking about those sorts of things. I get pleasure out of thinking about the meaninglessness of life and writing about it. But obviously, that can take you in a really dark direction. I mean, I think some people who are depressed, like David Foster Wallace, it's just biochemical, it's genetic. But I get these very distressing emails sometimes from young people who've read some of my stuff, like an 8, 19, 20-year-old, and they say that they don't see what the point of life is. Even I say that life is meaningless, and we have to create our own meaning. There is no God. And what's my advice? And I'm like, fuck, are you kidding? I don't know. Just try to take pleasure from the miracle of existence. We're all lucky to be alive, but that doesn't work for everybody. I think in my own case, I might just be genetically programmed to be cheerful no matter how bad things are.
Well, I mean, there's a piece of advice in there about creating your own meaning, which is interesting. I mean, it needs to be developed, but I think that a good place to start is doing something that you couldn't do previously, right? Like finding something extremely difficult to occupy yourself with. I think that's a good way to, Viktor Frankl's book. I'm sure you've read that. It is a good.
Man's Search
It's
for
a good
Meaning.
place to begin if you're feeling like life is meaningless, because here you have a guy who's stuck in a concentration camp. He doesn't know if anyone from his life even still remains alive, and yet he constructs this reality for himself where life is still worth living somehow. And it'll change you reading that book.
I think that a lot of Man's Search for Meaning actually centers around the idea of care, of taking care of those around you, right? Because if Frankl was a psychoanalyst and he ends up in either Auschwitz or Dachau or something, and he's still doing the work of the psychoanalyst for the people around him. So he's deeply tuned into the fact of their suffering. He's trying to help. He's trying to figure out what he can do for people. And there's this really, to like put it completely in the opposite direction, right? We've got like Holocaust survivor. There's a meme format which is called green text, which is 4chan. I don't totally understand. I've never been on 4chan, but there's some format in which people write stories about themselves, where they like reflect on some kind of realization that they've had. And there was one that I came across where this kid was like, "Hey, I was really lonely. I was really depressed. I hated life. I thought that nothing mattered. And then somebody gives me one of those dumb aquariums filled with brine shrimp. And I start taking...
Sea monkeys.
Yeah, sea monkeys, exactly. And he's like, I start taking care of the sea monkeys, and all of a sudden I become really aware of the fact that they depend on me. And so I realize that I need to go and get a job so that I have money to be able to take care of the sea monkeys. And it's this like long story, but the gist of it is that the guy found something to take care of, organized his life around the principle of, now that I have something to take care of, everything else is meaningful because this thing that I have invested emotionally in requires my assistance, and drags himself out of depression and horror because there is now something that literally means something, because without him it will die.
Viktor Frankl, by the way, I think he felt like he had to keep himself alive because his wife depended on him. Even though she would turn out to have been killed quite early on in the affair, he still was keeping himself alive in service of this other person.
Yeah, so I think that like meaning just comes from finding something to care about. I think that you're right that you create meaning, where it's like, it's not like you get born and you get like handed a little a stamped piece of paper that's like, this is going to be your meaning in life. But you figure it out over the course of existence. And I think that maybe removed people's hierarchical structures of like the hierarchy of needs. There isn't something on that hierarchy of needs that's like, well, you need something to take care of.
By the way, you don't have to spend any effort figuring out what's meaningful when you're starving to death, right? Like
Yeah.
you go and get food. Like that's very meaningful when you're hungry, or whatever it is. If like all of your babies are dying in childhood, like it's obviously very meaningful to have as many children as humanly possible, right? So I feel like humans have gotten into this level of progress, if you want to call it that, where we've taken care of all of these needs, and without needs, it's very difficult to find meaning.
Well, okay, so here, this is the question. Is there being a really strong external organizing principle that kind of takes care of stuff for us that we can offload these responsibilities onto, directly responsible for this crisis of meaning?
Oh God, I don't know. That's a complicated question. I sometimes, actually, in the end of science, I talk about I have a little thought experiment. Um, what if all our needs are taken care of? What if we all have the best education, the best healthcare? We all have all the, this is hard to imagine, but all the money we could possibly want. Our material needs are taken care of. So it's a utopia. What do we do? And the answer I came up with is that we do science. We do science because we're curious creatures. We want to know where we came from. We want to know what this is about. So I'm not talking about science giving us better healthcare fixes and smartphones and all that kind of stuff. I'm talking about science in its most grandiose form as this way we have of figuring out what's going on in ourselves and in the world. And so that's why it was distressing to me to think that science might be ending, that the really deep insights that science can give us might be in the past, and that the idea that science will give us some sort of final revelation where we suddenly understand what this is and why we're here, what our purpose is, if any, that this thought that I had, this argument that I ended up making, that we're not going to have that ever, was very distressing. Although it's better if there isn't an endpoint to our exploration, because then we can keep exploring. So it's kind of a paradox. Which do you prefer, to be eternally confused, or to suddenly understand everything, or think you understand everything, because that's much more likely. I don't really have this idea of utopia being purely scientific anymore. That was a very I was just projecting my own value system onto this little utopia I created. One of the wonderful things about humanity is that people have infinite ways of making meaning for themselves, of like just getting through the difficulties of life, some of which are, I know a lot of philosophers and scientists, so I tend to think the unexamined life is not worth living. Fuck that. There are people who can be perfectly happy not introspecting all the time and not wondering how the Big Bang happened and how life began and what consciousness is. We should be, and I think we can actually create a world in which humans are free to pursue all these different possible meanings and invent new ones that we haven't even thought of yet. But yeah, we might. What goes along with that is this sense of, I don't know, an identity crisis, wondering whether all our pursuits are somehow trivial, especially if there isn't some kind of divine intelligence toward which we aspire. We're really just on our own here. So I don't think it's avoidable that we will have moments of existential crisis as we pursue this kind of utopia.
Do you want to go ahead?
I mean, so like to tie this into the psychedelic blog that you're writing to some extent, it seems like a huge part of people moving out of depression often involves them letting go of their sense of who they are as a result of the past, of who they've been in the past. And there's something about that becoming, and I think that's why difficult tasks, taking care of people, redefining yourself on a regular basis seems to be at the core of what becomes meaningful for people. And particularly taking control of that on a daily basis, whether it's you're working towards a marathon or raising a child or something that's invariably new and difficult every day in a different way, seems to be at the core. And it seems what's interesting is that psychedelic therapy has become really popular lately, right? And that seems really strange, especially in branches of the military, people suffering from these incredible war traumas. And it's like, in some sense, that's kind of the last thing that you would have expected to be appealing in terms of a use of psychedelics. Because when I was growing up, it was like the DARE program, and psychedelics will like turn you into this paranoid madman who will jump off of a balcony or something. But the reality,
there wasn't really a difference between the effects of PCP and psilocybin.
Or marijuana even, right? Yeah. I was terrified of marijuana until I basically made it to college, and I was still terrified, even the first time that I did it. But the point is that people shatter their ideas of what they are on some of these really intense psychedelic experiences, and also mystical experiences. This doesn't have to involve drugs. There's other ways to have this happen. Intense athletic excursions, the birth of a child, the death of a loved one. Like there's ways to crack through, to really crack yourself and stop believing in this story that you've made for yourself of who you are. In which case you start constructing a new sense of who you are. And I think that's at the heart of what's meaningful to everybody across the board.
So to tease a little thread out of that, I think that it is in some sense the mystical experience that's so valuable, which is being able to take this moment to look at to step out of the universe and to look at it and to just be like, whoa, this is crazy. Like when we were reading William James talks about the varieties of religious experience, and he's literally like deja vu, walking down a street and suddenly paying attention to the way the light plays in the trees, the awareness of the entire universe having conspired to create this moment. And I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. I feel like that's something that is really easy to lose when you live in an artificial algorithmic environment where there's not really a lot of space for divinity. And so science in general creates a really molecular, rational, material paradigm where it's just atoms crashing into each other. If you're depressed, it's because your atoms are wrong. If you don't have any meaning, it's because your atoms are wrong. Take this molecule, take this pill, make this physical intervention on a biochemical level, and perhaps you'll be okay. And the reality of it is that there seems to be some other ineffable component, like the stuff that Shiloh's talking about, where you have somebody that has terrible, completely incurable PTSD where they're just unable to function. And then they go take a psychedelic, and the psychedelic doesn't seem to be the thing that fixes them. It's the experience that they have relating to themselves that suddenly transforms who they are. And I'm like, that's weird.
It's like the letting go of the unbearable weight of the experience they've been carrying around, from what I understand.
Yeah.
It's like, oh my God, all right, all this did happen to me, but that was an old me. It doesn't have to be the new me. Like that happened in the past and it is not happening now. And I can make whatever happen that I want at this point. And that revelation seems to be the transcendent moment.
So the question is, like, how do you have a society where people are just finding meaning? Like, does anybody go to work anymore? Does anybody do their menial email job? Like, who's sweeping the streets? Is anybody driving the garbage trucks? Is it possible to still have a society where everybody realizes the like unbearable meaningness of being, as opposed to the opposite, where they're just like trudging through the day?
Um, well, in my utopia, the robots do all the work that nobody really wants to do, that people only do for the money and they wouldn't do if they didn't have to. Uh, I am I'm really ambivalent about psychedelics. I mean, I'm an old acid head. Psychedelics have had a huge impact on me. I forget if we talked about this in our last conversation, but the end of my book, The End of Science, is about this monster trip that I had um, back in 1981, where I finally, if you're an acid head, you're always waiting for the big revelation that changes everything. And I finally got that, and it was more than I bargained for. Yeah, I was in the Olaf Stapledon Star Maker, whatever that novel is called, territory. And William James, the interesting thing about, William James wrote, it's still the best book on mystical religious experiences, and it's more than 100 years old now. Because he talked about the classic blissful unitive experience. You have that and you go, oh my God, the world seems really fucked up. But from this perspective, everything is cool. Okay, that's good for you that you've had that experience. But there are these other experiences, which James himself had, where the bottom drops out of everything and you are seen into like an infinite empty abyss. There is no meaning. There is no God. And it's not just the absence of meaning. In some cases, for some mystics, it's almost a malevolent force. And this happens in psychedelics too. So which is it? You can't just say, well, it's the happy experiences. That's the truth. That's what's really going on behind all the sort of chaos of existence. There's this eternal ocean of cosmic conscious bliss. But that's just your choice. If you're empirical or scientific about it, you have to acknowledge that people have all these other experiences. A lot of people's near-death experiences, some of them, you go in heaven, you see grandma, and everything's really cool. People have terrifying, nightmarish near-death experiences as well, where they feel that the afterlife is hellish. It's the dark night of the soul, that sort of thing. Again, David Foster Wallace in Infinite Jest, there is one section of his book where he obviously is talking as David Foster Wallace, where he's describing the most severe kind of depression, which is not just the absence of pleasure. It's and a feeling of meaninglessness. It's this active blackness that consumes you, that like eats your soul. And if you have a taste of this, you realize why, for some people, suicide isn't even an option. And you can't dismiss that either as just a result of brain chemistry. So I guess I'm saying that the psychedelics, I'm especially appalled at the idea of psychedelics being used for soldiers to heal them and maybe send them back out into battle feeling better about themselves. Mindfulness exercises have also been adopted by the Army. I feel the same ambivalence. It's because I'm a peacenik. I think war is bad. I think the United States is a warmongering monster of a nation that exports weapons and violence around the world. And so I don't like seeing psychotherapy being used to make soldiers healthier. I don't want to see soldiers at all. Yeah,
Most of the
sorry.
cases I've seen have been people who are like long through with war. They've just come back and their lives are wrecked in certain ways. I had a really weird experience. Like all my friends were into this postmodern stuff at the end of college, and I ended up, reading The Pinch and Infinite Jest right after college. And it's funny because I felt really betrayed by that literature. Like I really was at this romantic phase in my. Actually, I'm kind of a deep romantic in general, but I realized that I really was drawn to art that seemed to be pointing to me towards how to live better, like how to make my life more of a masterpiece. And it's funny because I just remember reading that and just feeling like this person was playing the worst joke. David Foster Wallace was playing the most terrible joke on the reader, which is just, he's just sitting there kind of laughing at you for keeping going. Like, are you still reading this? Are you still reading this? Like, you're such an idiot for reading this. And I made it all the way through too. But it's funny because I bounced straight from that into this deep period of Ayn Rand afterwards, which is literally the complete opposite. It's like these heroic characters who are self-motivated and know the way towards the right versus wrong, lover or hater. Like, her characters are strong moral actors who believe in what they're doing. And like, that's what I needed as a young person, actually, much more than this kind of hippie, like, anything goes, man, kind of thing, which was just, I just saw it just destroying people around me, and myself to some extent, really, right? Because
It's really that's a really interesting reaction. It's hard for me to read Wallace without knowing how he ended up, and without knowing about how uh, horribly depressed he was for much of his adult life. And so when I'm reading Infinite Jest, one thing that keeps me going is it's obnoxious. It's kind of like immature, and I felt the same way about Pynchon. I couldn't get through Gravity's Rainbow because both of them felt like smart ass teenagers, kind of showing off how smart they are and how much stuff they know. And there wasn't this what I want from a like 1,000-page novel or even a 500-page novel, is a sense of wisdom, of sophisticated grasp of the world and how humans work, and love and pain and heartbreak and all those things that makes me feel better about my own life. And yeah, Wallace is like kind of sneering and giggling his way through that whole book, but there's this deep strain of loneliness and melancholy through the whole thing that to me justifies it. And his characters are dealing with that pain also, even when they're doing crazy, kind of funny, silly stuff. And it may be just because it's my mood right now, but it occurs to me, and I just tried to put this in a column, that Wallace is onto something that Tolstoy and Joyce, my favorite authors, aren't onto. They are trying to give a sort of have this embracing view of the human condition. Yeah, we're kind of we're really fucked up in lots of ways, but we're still loving creatures trying to do the best. And I think that Wallace is saying that we're deluded creatures. We delude ourselves in all sorts of ways to get through life. We lie to others, we lie to ourselves. We have all these compulsions, all these addictions, not just drugs and alcohol, but love, sex, intellectual work, science, all these things that we do kind of frantically to avoid a confrontation with reality, whatever that is. And I think in some ways, Wallace is more brutally honest in dealing with meaninglessness than my two favorite authors, Tolstoy and Joyce. But it might be just because I'm in kind of a dark mood because of the election.
Well, it could
So I don't
also
know.
be that life was less meaningless when Joyce and Tolstoy were writing. Like, I think that it's entirely possible that a meaningless life is an entirely modern problem. It's an entirely a problem of like post World War II affluence. And if that's the case, then they couldn't possibly write about the meaninglessness of life because they're like, what do you mean life is meaningless? How could you possibly even process that as a statement?
There are characters in Tolstoy, he's mainly looking at the aristocracy in Russia. So these are people whose material needs are taken care of, and they're having existential crises. They're trying to figure out what it means to be a good person, how to live a good life. They're dealing with war and romance and having a good job and rising in society and all of that stuff. And the intelligence among them go, is this it? Is this all it is? So I actually think, I guess I'm suspicious of uh, of any kind of perspective that makes us feel like we've got it worse than people than people in the past. I think this struggle with meaninglessness is pretty eternal. One big difference between now and like 200 years ago or 100 years ago in Dublin, when it comes to Ulysses, is that we don't have as much religion anymore. But I think even when people had religion, it wasn't necessarily as much of a source of solace as we might think from our modern perspective. People had doubts when bad things happen in the world. Assholes do well and good people flounder. People would wonder, what the hell is, God loves us, so what's this about? I think those are just universal difficulties with being human.
Do you think that authors are responsible for providing a path forward to their readers? Like, I often, look, you have to cultivate taste as an artist or a writer or something, right? You have to know what you like. And for me, the things that I like, and I could apply this to science as well. A theory that I like is something that allows me to, it's productive. It allows me to operate inside of a new framework that is productive to me understanding more and more phenomena in the scientific sense. But for art, it would be a book that allowed some transformation of my way of thinking that was expanding my ability to operate in the world. And I feel like these postmodernists did nothing of the sort. They were just kind of showing you how ugly reality is without actually providing any path forward in it. And I just always felt I was getting cheated by these people.
All right, so I was an English major in college, and I thought about getting a PhD in literature and becoming a literary critic. And then I read so much literary criticism, and I just thought these guys are just, it's like, it's intellectual masturbation. They never get anywhere. They're just arguing with each other. Whereas science makes progress. And there's this debate over what art is and what it's for. It goes way back. I mean, back to the Greeks. And there's this idea that art should have some kind of purpose, as you say, like help give us insight, help us understand what we are and how to move forward, and that there maybe should be some kind of moral payoff from art, although that's putting it a little crudely. But I talked to this wonderful philosopher and novelist named Rebecca Goldstein about 6 or 7 years ago. And this is related to the idea of progress and optimism and all that sort of stuff. And so I asked Goldstein if she thought, she's a novelist and a philosopher, is it her responsibility to be optimistic? because I sometimes feel it's my responsibility to be optimistic as a teacher and a parent, a writer. And she kind of thought about that for a second. Then she said, no, it's my responsibility to be realistic, which is not the same as having a moral message, being optimistic and saying life is basically good and here's how to make it better. And so I see that the postmodernists or the ironists or whatever you want to call uh, David Foster Wallace and Pynchon, and there are a lot of others. Oh, there's some German writer who won the Nobel Prize a while back, and he is oh my God, he's so bleak. It just makes you want to blow your brains out. He wrote the goalie's anxiety at the penalty kick. You remember? Anyway, which is about a murderer, and it's just there's some literature you read
Peter
it and you realize
Handke?
how, yeah, that guy, and you realize how sappy most literature is, how much it sugarcoats things. You read Henke and it's like, life sucks, it's meaningless, it's just like this Darwinian struggle and you die. And I don't believe that, but I like artists that make me feel as though I'm really confronting a hard truth. And then it's my job to decide what to do with that, how to move on from that, how to because I do believe there's such a thing as being a good person, and there are other people who are not so good, and that trying to be good is meaningful. It's a worthy endeavor, and trying to be good to other people. But I don't want to. I want to look reality straight on. It's impossible, but I want to try. And some writers help me do that, even though it is very painful.
Yeah, I think there's some. I wouldn't say that having gone through that experience personally of studying the postmodernists and hanging out with a bunch of friends who were postmodernists at the time, like that was good for me in the end because it oriented me away from that. And I feel like that was valuable in its own right. And so I feel like I can see that oftentimes art, this is why I really love old folk music, from the American South and so forth. And just the folk tradition of these blues tales of just everything going wrong, right? It's just like the worst things possible happening to these people, mainly because they're making bad decisions, and sneaking out the back door and doing all this stuff, right? And you can learn a lot about the road to misery. And I think in general, it's a lot easier to define what's bad than it is what's good, right? If we try to define evil, almost everybody can tell you what's evil. But it's very hard for somebody to tell you what's ideal in the most good sense. Even defining God, for instance, is almost impossible for most people. But it's very easy to see what's bad. And so I can see the value in art like that shows you what you don't want to be, which is twiddling your thumbs at a tennis academy and whatever the heck else it was about. Yeah.
I think that
Junkies and tennis rackets.
Yeah, I think that the problem comes when people lose the sense that the postmodernist literature is not I don't think that it's a realistic picture of the world. Like, I think that there is a way where you can say that you're being a realist that justifies your own really pessimistic worldview and says, well, I'm just calling it like I see it. And it's like, yeah, well, you could easily take the same circumstances and see it otherwise and transmute that into something that carries different overtones.
It's like photography. Like photography is kind of a similar thing. It's like, well, that is a picture of whatever it is. But the reason photography is even an art in its best case scenario is because of the angle and the subject matter that's chosen and the lighting and like these like tiny little details that actually bring a human trajectory to it.
Yeah. And so I'm like, okay, so literature is this place where people choose the angle and the trajectory of the story that they tell in the hopes of transmitting something, which I think that for a lot of people, the same way that a melancholy song is much more it sticks with you more than a happy one. Like, this is a very superficial and stupid example, but I always think of Alanis Morissette. Wrote like one of the defining albums of the 1990s, really angsty and angry and full of passion. And I think she got married and her life turned out really good, and she's never, ever written a good song since. And she's like still out there doing stuff. And I'm like, power to you, Alanis. But like something happened when she lost this connection to the suffering of her existence that precluded her from being able to write well. And you see this all the time. People are like, I have to be addicted to drugs or alcohol or creating terrible circumstances in my life in order to be able to create interesting art.
Crazy women.
Crazy women.
That's a very popular one in the music world I come from.
It's still in yours as well, or you've moved past that?
All right. There's an interesting hinge here that we could make, which is, okay, so artists inevitably choose their subject matter. They choose an angle. Does the same thing happen in science?
Exactly where I was going to go.
Are we in a postmodern version of that narrative structure for science at the moment?
Oh, most definitely. I think one of the wonderful things that's happened since I've been a science journalist is that the consensus is shattering. The paradigms are all wobbling. I see this in physics and biology. So if your dream, and it was my dream when I first became a science journalist in the early 80s, it was my dream and widely shared that science is converging on an accurate representation of nature, of the world, of the entire universe, of life on Earth, all that stuff, and that we're kind of zeroing in on answers to the big questions. And now, that take consciousness, for example. So in the 90s, you had Francis Crick laying out a program for solving consciousness with research on the brain and humans and non-human animals. And there are very different theories about what the neural code is, the algorithms that transform neural signals into memories and perceptions and all that. And it looked like, I had my doubts, which I talked about in The End of Science, but it looked like a reasonable approach to understanding this profound mystery, how matter makes mind. And now, in September, I went to this, maybe this is a selection problem here, but I went to a conference convened by Deepak Chopra, the not sure what to call him, sort of health, spirituality entrepreneur. And there are a whole bunch of consciousness scientists there. Stuart Hameroff is probably the best known. He's the guy who's proposed this theory of consciousness along with Roger Penrose, the great physicist. And I moderated a panel with about 5 of these people who had consciousness theories. And it was just so nutty. It was like there's no center anymore. Everybody is on the fringe. And that would have been distressing to me 30 years ago. But now I think it's great. I guess I am a postmodernist when it comes to science, because I don't really believe in absolute truth as something toward which all these different strands of science converge. Now I think we're just we grasp these things that work for a while. They turn out to have certain applications. But in terms of actually mapping onto the world and being some kind of part of some kind of final understanding of what this is, I don't believe that anymore. I don't think that science is capable of a lot of things. I don't want to overstate the case for postmodernism, but things are getting weirder, stranger, more postmodern all the time, I would say, overall.
I really struggle with this in my own teaching at the university, because I teach an astronomy, our first year astrophysics cosmology course, essentially. I think we talked about it probably last time. And it's interesting because I do half of the course, I have them reading a standard textbook, and doing some exercises based on the standard narrative of planetary science, astrophysics, cosmology. But then I spend a good deal of the lecture also presenting the cracks in a lot of these ideas. And it's always really interesting at the beginning of the semester bringing the kids into this fold where, despite the lack of certainty that's beginning to make itself known, it's still exciting, and it doesn't have to be this really terrifying chaos as a result of it. Like, we're still trying to order ideas in a productive way by examining these cracks, and I hope that I can pull that off, because I actually had this meaninglessness feeling when I first started studying science. I showed up at college. I had an advisor who was in the physics department. I wanted to be a physicist. And the guy basically talked me out of it. He basically convinced me that all of the big problems had been dealt with. There was really nothing left to do in physics. And I'd be better off doing something new like neuroscience, right? Which I ended up doing. And when I'm teaching, like, I want to make people aware that there is so much left to be explained. There is so much, but I also don't want to cross over into the territory of postmodern anxiety where it feels like we know absolutely nothing. And I don't think that's the right way to look at it either. I don't think we know absolutely nothing. I just think that the more we know, the more questions appear. And of course, even some of those questions can fold back on our original premises of how we got to that initial knowledge in the first place. But yeah, how to walk that line has always been a real challenge for me.
Well, I think that we're living through this foment of what happens before you have a paradigm, right? Because Kuhn has this model of pre-paradigmatic science, and then the paradigm emerges, and then everybody's just beavering away in the laboratory figuring out how to expand upon the paradigm. And I think that when you're living through the moment where everything becomes chaotic again, it can feel really disturbing because the ground falls out from under you, where you're like, oh, well, we have this main sequence of stars, and this tells us a story about the universe, and this is very reassuring and relaxing because we have all of these things that we know, and then all of these things start to come out from the new telescopes, and you're looking out and you're like, oh my God, we might know nothing. And that's the moment where you have all of these ideas that suddenly spring up, where people take advantage of the fact that there is the possibility that we actually know nothing. And there is the possibility that what happens right now is that we have to reinvent all of our preconceived
notions. The emperor has no clothes.
The emperor, yeah, there's like a little kid screaming. But I'm like, even in biology, there's been really, really interesting research in the last few years that has been kind of whispering, where people are like, hey, it seems like cells all throughout the body have memory, and it seems like consciousness is not just in the brain, it's like everywhere, and nobody really knows what to do with it, and it breaks all of the rules that we have for the way that minds and bodies should work. And we're still arguing about whether or not the placebo effect works. Like, I see a think piece every week which is arguing really, really extensively for the fact that the placebo effect is garbage. And then the next week, somebody argues with the same depth that the placebo effect is in fact real and something we should be considering. And so I'm like, okay, maybe this feeling of just what the fuck is happening in science right now and why can't we decide on anything is a reflection of the fact that the vein of knowledge that we have mined for the past 60, 70 years has run out. We've hit the edge of certainty, and now we have to look back and be like, okay, well, what are the mistakes that we made? What are the things that we can re-examine in order to construct a brand new metaphysics so that there is a new paradigm? Like, it just feels like we're in that moment just before a paradigm emerges.
I totally agree. I want to go back to what I said before. I don't want to overstate the degree to which I'm a postmodernist. For example, I still believe in the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory is a really sensible explanation for all these different strands of data coming from astronomy, astrophysics, lots of different areas of research. I still believe in the theory of evolution as an incredibly powerful organizing principle for biology and the history of life on Earth. It's just that there are these kind of subversive trends in biology. For example, I read this book recently by an excellent British journalist called Philip Ball. Have you had him on your show by any chance? Have you heard of this guy? He's
I've heard of him, but
really, really good. He's written a whole bunch of books, and his most recent is basically challenging the degree to which genes are the right organizing principle for understanding evolution and the way that biology works now. And he says when you go deep into how cells work, you're just confronted with this extraordinary complexity, and genes become just one of these many components of the cell that make them work and that help cells coordinate. So you have this amazingly complicated multicellular creature like a human being. And Ball is kind of conservative, which is what makes his book all the more powerful and persuasive. So I had him speak to my school recently, and I said, "Are you talking about like a paradigm shift here? And, is this revolutionary science? Is it toppling the idea that evolution plus DNA-based genetics really is the way to understand life?" And he says, "No, not really, but that is kind of what he's saying." And at the end of his book, he gets into this discussion of how the more he thinks about life, the more he realizes that agency has to be part of the discussion. At one point, does agency emerge in the history of life? Where does agency begin in a creature like us? Is it a kind of meta emergent thing that comes out of our complexity, or is it more deeply embedded in our flesh? Is it possible that individual cells could have a little tiny smidgen of agency? So the science figures stuff out. I believe there is this foundation of science on which we build, and at the same time, there's all this undermining constantly going on. That's making that.
This is what's so fascinating about this, is because, like, think about the arc that this represents. We come from a philosophy that says that there is this vis viva, or like the
life force.
Yeah, there's some substance that animates life that causes it to look the way that it does. We shift fully into a material paradigm where we're like, no, absolutely not. It is simply like DNA, RNA, protein. That is it. Natural selection is this law of nature that everybody abides by. And then we get to a point where we end up at trying to explain the totality of nature, and we're like, oh shit, agency and meaning and will has to play a role in this, because how else could it work? And I'm like, obviously it does. How did we make the mistake of thinking that agency doesn't play a role in something that is defined by agency? Like, if you look at the NASA.
By the way, bringing agency, if you bring up agency with a hardcore science, is literally a conversation stopper in any topic, from astrophysics to cell biology, bacteriology. Like, just insinuating that we should even use that word, or we like the word will a lot, like desire, motivation. Like, what is this intention? Yeah, this is a complete showstopper, and I think that underscores just how allergic the modern paradigm is to reconsidering this idea.
And
by the way,
go ahead.
I've just got to suggest another scientist author for you, a guy named Kevin Mitchell, who's an Irish biologist, who was kind of the anti-Sapolsky. So Sapolsky, of course, wrote the book called Determined. And so I also had him speak to my school. I love his book, even though I think I'm horrified by his argument. So I wrote a review of it, and pointing out that I coined this phrase called the Sapolsky paradox. The paradox is that this 500-page book that argues there is no free will is constructed out of almost an infinite number of aesthetic and intellectual choices, which demonstrate that Sapolsky, of course, does have free will. Anyway, Kevin Mitchell wrote a book that came out right around the time that Sapolsky published his, and Mitchell's book didn't get nearly as much attention, but it's a brilliant, very sophisticated defense of the idea that there is whatever you want to call it, free will, which is kind of a flaky, old-fashioned term, but I still love it, or agency, choices built into biology from the bottom up. So I don't think, you definitely conversation stopper, agency, free will, intention, and all this kind of stuff, but it's opening up. And the flip side of this, now you have people talking very seriously about panpsychism and these models in which you have consciousness pervading everything. I've taken a lot of LSD, so I'm sort of, part of me is attracted to those ideas, but also a lot of it seems really flaky and is kind of wishful thinking to me. And so I'm still kind of a hardcore materialist. This meeting I was at with Deepak Chopra and these other people, they were all non-materialists. They were all arguing for the notion that consciousness is more fundamental than matter. And I was kind of going, really? I don't know. That seems like a stretch. But these conversations are happening.
I mean, this is so interesting. Okay, so there's a couple of different directions that we can go to here. One is the question of, like, what actually drives evolution and speciation and the apparent diversity of species that we encounter. The other is whether or not it's actually reasonable to see consciousness as being fundamental, or if it's much more reasonable to see consciousness as like an antenna phenomenon. Shiloh and I have been playing with this recently. And these are kind of different directions. And they're both things that we've kind of explored on the show before, but I don't think that we've ever made the full case for either one of these. Shiloh, what do you think?
Yeah, I also just wonder if, spiritual explanations for motivation, if we could say that, or motivational explanations for evolutionary phenomenon or whatever, biological explanations that point to will, they don't have to necessarily be incompatible with thermodynamic explanations, right? So it occurs to me that there's multiple ways to look at something that are true at the same time, mutual truths. I just worry that if we don't have multiple methods to talk about things, that we'll be missing part of the truth because we only see it from one side.
Okay, so this leads nicely into evolution. Okay. And multiple truths when you look at evolution. Natural selection must be the case because it is a mechanism by which the environment molds the development of a creature, right? It's this kind of top-down thing where if you make a really stupid mistake, you and your entire lineage gets wiped out, you don't procreate, okay, fine. But then there's also a bottom-up perspective on this, which is like, okay, well, every creature has some spectrum of choices that's available to them. Whether it's, I'm going to bed down at this place, or I'm going to go across the hill and explore what's over there and see. Like, in the most basic sense, there's a foundational motivational difference between two creatures of the same type, which, if it is able to be transmuted into some kind of long-term cultural transmission, which is like, we are the types of creatures who stay versus we are the types of creatures who explore, that leads to eventual speciation. You can be like, okay, well, that was shaped by natural selection because there's not enough food for everybody to stay in the same place. And I'm like, maybe, but surely agency has some effect to it, where there's like an awareness inside of the I honestly think that there's even awareness inside of bacterial minds. Like, I know that that's, again, like totally off the table, but I've told this story before. Shiloh and I were in Hawaii, and we went snorkeling. And we were, there's this reef filled with fish, and there was one really weird type of fish. It was this long, kind of like needly eel-looking thing with this like very long nose. Very beautiful, kind of changed colors in the sunlight. And Shiloh and I both were just kind of floating above it, and you could see that it was like looking up at us, and that it was aware of the fact that we were there. And we just kind of both decided to stay there, and it started to swim away from us, and we started following it. And it took us on a tour of the reef, like a circular tour. It went like in a big wide circle as we followed it, came back to the same place, hung there for a few minutes, saw that we were still there, and then it was like, okay, well, let's go somewhere else. And then it took us on another circle, brought us to where there was a sea turtle feeding. We watched the sea turtle for a while, and I was like, that's pretty cool. And Shiloh motions me over. The fish is waiting for us to be done with the sea turtle, and then it takes us and brings us back to the exact same place where we started. And then we kind of float there for a little bit, and then it takes us in a circle in the opposite direction. And like, we eventually lose interest, but the fish is just kind of like, this is what we do. We just go around the reef. And so I'm like, that fish made a choice. Like, there's no, you can't explain this with just atoms bumping into each other purely. Like, there's some kind of agency involved in the way that that fish interacted with us. And so I'm like, if you can generalize that to all of biology, then you have no choice but to integrate agency into the development of species, which then feeds back onto our earlier conversation about meaning and postmodernism and meaninglessness, where I'm like, the reality that you construct, the choices that you make about how you describe nature in the world, foundationally come down to the kind of lineage that you are creating.
It's a wonderful story. And it's part of its charm is, this cross species communication and kind of sharing of experience between humans and a fish. So here's when I encounter these ways of looking at the world. So I was talking about panpsychism before, and the idea that consciousness is somehow fundamental. Those all bring me back to my childhood. I was raised Catholic, and to the idea that there is a consciousness pervading the universe, and it's benign, it's loving, and isn't that nice? And then I read about this all the time. I wrote a column about this after Trump was elected, called "The Election and the Problem of Evil." The problem of evil is it's the I know a theologian, Houston Smith. He said it's the shoal on which all theologies founder, all notions of God. Why is life so painful and unfair? If there's a God who loves us, and these philosophers and scientists who were talking about consciousness pervading the universe, or even pervading and consciousness and agency pervading all living things, starting with the simplest, even bacteria. They're all kind of pointing, I think, towards some kind of spiritual perspective, which is supposed to make us feel good. And it's too easy for me to go, oh yeah, life is fundamentally good because my life is good, because like I'm white Caucasian, and my life is good. I am extremely lucky, but not so good for a lot of other people.
There's a lot of white Caucasians out here whose life is not going well for, just so you know.
Okay, yes. I mean, life is hard. The only theology that makes any sense for me is one that this comes from my own drug trips, and it's also from Freeman Dyson, and some other people have talked about it. You find hints of it in Carl Jung and Gnosticism, which is that there is a God, but there's something wrong with God. Or there is a God, but God needs to make life interesting, needs to make it difficult. going back to psychedelics, this is something that Terence McKenna wrote about. Terence McKenna said that the purpose of existence is to generate novelty for our delectation. Like we have a tendency, we're designed by natural selection to get used to things. But we respond to something new and exciting, novel. And so McKenna says that's built into the fabric of the universe. That's his kind of God principle. And I said, well, so Nazis, that was like God gave us that to make the world more interesting. And he goes, yeah, I mean, I know sometimes novelty sucks, but even the Nazis served a purpose. So it's a very, very cold, callous theology, but it's either that or just accepting that it's all random and meaningless. And we have these little charming moments where we see the beauty of nature and we feel like we're bonding, we're communicating with nature. But then there's all this horrifying stuff that we have to take into account as well.
Yeah, and I think that any theology that says that the goal of the universe is just to create good things or to create satisfaction is losing the thread, because it seems superficially apparent, at least to me, that the whole point is to figure out how to wrestle with evil.
The struggle. It's all about the struggle, right? Like the reason that anything is meaningful at all is not because good is served to you on a plate, but because you can pursue it and it's difficult. And if you don't, then you end up somewhere evil. So without the ability to experience evil or even fall into it yourself, you don't have a path towards good either. You have no free will, essentially, otherwise.
Yeah, like it's really interesting to me because I feel like in the life that we live today, very few people spend a lot of time thinking about the Holocaust and how it could have happened. And the only person that I've really seen doing a lot of this is Jordan Peterson, who obviously it's crazy to say, but like he's the first person in pop culture that I saw over the course of the last 15 or 20 years being like, yo, we really need to think about what happened in the Holocaust and how it could easily happen again, and what are those forces, and use it as this phenomenon of figuring out ourselves relative to the most horrific evils. And that conversation's just not even happening anywhere else. And it's so depressing to me that he's turned into the kind of caricature of himself that he has, right? He's on the Daily Wire now, and he's, you look at his
book Ordinary Man does an extraordinary job of that. And I'm not sure.
What's this book?
I don't know who it's by. Have you read Ordinary Man? It's really fascinating. It essentially is it's a collection of letters and accounts of people who were started off as policemen, I believe on the Polish front at the beginning of the Nazi blitzkrieg, but also the early stages of their extermination of undesirables. And it's kind of this step-by-step playbook of how a regular person involved in a bureaucracy, like being a policeman, could be walked like handheld to the point that they are stripping pregnant women naked and shooting them in the head in the woods. Like, how does that happen to a normal person? And it's really fascinating because it really does show you how it could happen to you. Despite how good you think you are, it's fascinating that there is a little piece of every single person that is capable of participating in that under the right circumstances. And without like reading these accounts of these ordinary people who find themselves in these real binds, right? They can't really walk away from the situation that they've been at. They've seen too much. They feel threatened themselves, their own families and livelihoods. Like, people are complex. And, the Nazi leadership had a way of making sure that, the people were sufficiently drunk, or they were, they would only let them do so many murders before giving them a rest break. And like, it was all very very well engineered for the participants in these murders to have an experience that they would never have leaned into on their own. And so I think that book, more than anything else I've ever seen, does an incredible job of revealing how that evil can come out of really almost anyone. I think that there are certain people who would prefer to take the bullet themselves than participate in that, but you don't know that you're one of those people until you're faced with it, I think is really what the book shows. It's like, you might think you're a good person and you would never do that, but wait till you go through something like this. Wait till you're actually led every step along the way to the point that you've already gotten used to beatings, like you've already gotten used to the political rhetoric that these people are destroying our country, and you've already kind of like bought in very slowly all along the way. You buy into these little dehumanizations to the point that you're starting to think about them as cattle or something, or as, it's very disturbing. But I think there's no way to understand that without looking at the personal accounts of people who have been through that, because they weren't just murder. They weren't just psychopathic serial killers for the most part. They were ordinary people.
So I wrote this book called The End of War. It's my upbeat end of book, and I steep myself in the literature of war and what the Nazis did. This dehumanization, or this descent into terrible cruelty, is something that happens across history, and in virtually every war. Certainly wars where, not just two standing armies shooting at each other, but wars where civilians get involved. The United States carried out firebomb campaigns against Germany and Japan, and the Robert McNamara, who's this brilliant military strategist who was head of Ford Motor Company. There's this great film, The Fog of War, where he talks about how he helped to design the campaign of incendiary bombing of Tokyo, taking advantage of the fact that Japanese houses are mostly wood. And so with a very small investment in gasoline-based bombs, you could destroy a lot of property and kill a lot of people. And he says in this film that he certainly would have been prosecuted as a war criminal if the United States had lost the war. I don't think that war stems from some like innate bloodlust in us. We create these environments that turn ordinary people into monsters. The Nazis are not exceptional. Shelley, you're absolutely right. It can happen to any of us. And so my hope is that we create a world. This is part of my belief in progress. We create a world where those situations don't arise. We realize that they can't arise. We can't have a situation like that happening. Of course, right now it is happening. It's happening in the Middle East. It's happening in Ukraine. It's happening across the world where the U.S. is fighting terrorism. I still cling to the hope that I don't think this is, part of some kind of plan of God. It's something that we do to each other. And we create situations where this monstrous behavior becomes inevitable. So we have to recognize that and do something about it and get rid of that. I still have this hope. It's hard to sustain right now that we will eventually evolve toward a world without war.
As we're talking about this, I can't help but I'm thinking about the entire postmodern project, which says that there's not really a place where you can plant the flag of like what is good and what is bad. And I've always had a superficial read on that where I've kind of assumed that it was just people playing with subverting traditional perspectives of biblical morality or whatever. But then I'm also thinking about it as we're talking about the idea of ordinary men becoming fully warped by their circumstances, and thinking about how something like that happens. And the way that something like that happens is because somebody starts to tell you what is true and what isn't true. Somebody's standing in front of you and telling you that these people are destroying the world, and so you must attack them. And you take that to be true, and then incorporate that so fully into your morality that you are then driven towards bad things. And so postmodernism is like an immune response to be able to say that, no, hold on. Even if somebody in authority is telling you that this is absolutely true, truth is relative. And so you are free to take that into yourself and subvert it and to reject the instruction. And I've never really thought about it that way before, but it suddenly creates a mechanistic function for postmodernism that I've never really considered.
Yeah, that's really interesting as like a reaction. I also want to unpack what you mean by God too.
Pardon the interruption. I have to ask you, if you were enjoying this podcast and you've listened to a couple episodes and you like what we do and you want to help us in our mission to continue to produce this podcast without putting any kinds of advertisements or sponsors on it, consider coming over to patreon.com/demystifysci. I can't point to it yet because it doesn't happen yet. For just a couple dollars a month, you can support the project. You can help us make sure that we never put advertisements on this, that we are never selling something as a mechanism for producing this podcast. And hopefully we will see you there at patreon.com/demystifysci.
What's that thing in the middle of your screen?
What's that?
That there's a disc with a yellow thing. Yeah,
Okay.
what is that?
That's a thread painting of a moon that was done by one of our listeners, one of our patrons actually, and he sent it to us. So it's a wooden disc that has all of these metal.
I think it's like a embroidery hoop of some sort, right?
It's not an embroider hoop that I've ever seen before. It's basically a wooden disc with all of these metal loops in it. And he's used thread to create the picture of the moon. And he does all of these other ones where he does portraits and he does landscapes and all kinds of really cool stuff.
It's great. It's really, I've been distracted by it the whole time. Like, what the hell is that thing?
Yeah, I'm still working on the lighting in this set because it's a little bit I feel like it's a little bit dark, and so the moon is a little bit overexposed relative to how dark everything else is. And in an ideal world, it would be like brought down 1 or 2 stops, but if it was brought down enough to expose the moon properly, everything else is too dark. And so we're slowly navigating our way through professional lighting. We only recently actually bought a real light. We used to have the only light that we had was one that we made 4 years ago, which consisted of a plastic tub with a bunch of weatherproof sockets hot glued into it with like 8 light bulbs, which we wired ourselves and did not survive the road trip back from our last conference. It slowly rattled itself apart. So we're in the big boys club now. We have real lights.
Yeah, I'm using a light box that I use for seasonal affective disorder as my lighting.
Yeah, it looks really good.
Perfect.
Have you ever tried infrared lights?
A friend of mine got me this, so I don't even know what this if this has any infrared in it, but that's good for seasonal affective disorder.
We had a guy on the podcast who was insisting that it was everything. I mean, he made the interesting point that how people walking around in nature is really good for them. I mean, there's obviously a psychological effect, but it turns out that they reflect a lot of infrared light, right? As a result of them essentially being green, they absorb. He was actually, the problem was that he was actually manufacturing light bulbs at the end of the day. And so we had a really hard time understanding whether he was just trying to sell light bulbs or whether there was actually a compelling case. And he did point to a lot of different scientific literature, but you can find a study for almost anything. So it was very tricky to unpack at the end of the day.
But I know that there's a lot of red light therapy that is purporting to show really serious benefits. And infrared light in general, there's a lot of There's a lot of ladies in skincare forums that use these really hilarious infrared face masks. I don't know if you've ever seen these. They look like something out of a sci-fi horror movie because they're these like white plastic faces with holes for your eyes and your mouth, and they irradiate you with infrared light. And
Eek.
but apparently it's very good for your skin. Everybody reports fantastic results. And so your mileage may vary, but apparently it's very good for seasonal affective disorder too. So who knows?
Cheapest kind of sauna you can buy too.
Is it true?
Well, I guess, right? Like you can get just infrared light bulbs and make your bathroom into a sauna.
I actually have plans for
wanna
that
do it,
downloaded
yeah,
onto
yeah.
my computer, but I don't know if our breaker would take it. But we'll see. Time is still there's ample time for such things.
So postmodernism as an immune system.
Yeah, I mean, like we're going back and forth about all of these ideas of, people do horrible things. We've eradicated the idea of meaningness from science and from our society. We've opened ourselves up to all of these really kind of yawning chasms. And I'm like, well, why have we done that? And it seems easily mapped that, okay, well, we have this really horrific series of events that happen on the back of a central authority telling everybody what is truth. And then everybody kind of shakes themselves awake from the bad dream and is like, wait, hey, nobody can tell you top down what truth is. You have to figure it out. And the process of figuring out truth is actually quite difficult. I don't think you can go to your day job and spend a lot of time thinking about what is true and good, because the same way, this is obviously a complete overstatement, but like the same way that the ordinary men are part of the death patrols, the person who's working like a dead-end email job is so fully ensconced in that system that any amount of thought about, oh my God, what does this mean? Why am I doing this? Is deeply destabilizing. And so everybody's just in stasis a little bit without any overarching top-down truth except for buy, like whatever's being piped in on the commercials. And is yet feeling this weird thing of like, why are we doing this? What is happening? And science can't provide the answer. We're very skeptical about the answer coming from externally, and yet we don't have a system in place for being like, hey, this is how you derive meaning, except for like...
Can I throw another spanner in the gears? It seems like the place that religion once held, where we were comfortable with talking about this word God, was replaced by this rationalism that science excelled at. And the technological fruits of the scientific process and this very mechanistic understanding of nature were abundant and very obvious. And it made for an ideology that seemed worthy of bowing down to for many, many years. But
Just because it was so successful?
Just because he was so successful in terms of quality of life and comfort and all of these things.
So you're thinking like turn of the century science, like 1900s to like the atom bomb.
Yeah, sure. And even up through the present, the internet, cell phones, home recording studios, whatever it is, right? It's been very fruitful, this scientific project, but it doesn't seem to have anything to say about good and evil in and of itself, right? It doesn't really have anything to say about which way you should be orienting your life. And I think that's, I know it seems silly, but it seems like that's been surprising to people. Like they're kind of surprised that science can't address these issues.
I would go one step farther, and as somebody who worked in animal labs and did animal research, I would say that science actually actively subverts your horror reflex. Like if you look at neuroscience research, if you look at animal research,
cancer research,
the
behavioral neuroscience,
it boggles the mind. They're like, okay, so in order to look at how the cat responds to stimulus, we severed its neck and we made it walk on a treadmill in order to see like what vertebra we had to sever the spine at in order to remove the autonomic response. And you're like, you're reading it, and on one level there's the scientific mind that's like, oh, that's it's quite interesting that it happens at the L7 vertebra. And on the other hand, you're like, what the fuck Mengele shit is this? And you're literally trained out of that response, because I remember being in laboratories and being like, hey, isn't it totally twisted what we're doing to these mice? And people are like, you get used to it.
The reviewers are like, you need to do 200 more mice, actually, for us to get statistical significance out of this experiment.
That won't replicate in any other lab ever.
I just want to point out that you're not describing amorality. So the absence of morality, you are describing a particular kind of morality or value system that comes with science, that says that the suffering of animals is less important than the knowledge gleaned. And then, usually there's some argument about how this research will benefit humans and all of that. There's some philosophers who say that science, strictly speaking, tells us what is, and that has nothing to do with what should be. It doesn't have anything to do with the realm of ethics and morality. And that's bullshit. It always has been bullshit. Science comes with its own system of values. So, for example, neuroscientific research, going way back, started telling us that mental illness is really a biochemical, neurochemical malfunction, maybe genetically based as well. And that leads to this idea that maybe biochemical treatments are the best rather than the old-fashioned talk therapy. And so that leads to the whole psychopharmaceutical revolution, which are, again, the value system is saying, this is better. This is better than the other forms of treatment. So science is intertwined. The question of what has always been intertwined with the question of what should be. And it seems to me that when scientists and sort of science worshiping philosophers say that those are two separate things, they're really just providing a kind of cover for all these kind of unpleasant things that scientists are doing, like torturing animals. They're not torturing them on purpose, but they're causing pain to animals to try to gain a little bit of knowledge. So I want to go back to what you said, Anastasia, about postmodernism being a kind of immune response, because I think that's absolutely right. When I look at human history, I see it as this struggle to understand what it is to be human, to come up with some kind of explanation for what life is, and it tells us what we are and how we should live. And you've got all these different responses to that very, very deep question, mainly most of human history, religious responses. So you've got Buddhism and Christianity and Judaism and Islam, and these are all systems that say this is what's going on, and this is how you should live your life. And then gradually, beginning with the ancient Greeks, but it really took off, at the beginning of the scientific revolution, this new way of understanding the world that had its own value system came into being. The problem is, it's not like we had superstition before, and now we have this rational, great way of understanding the world and figuring out what we should do with our lives, because the Enlightenment produced, the Pinkers and people like that don't like this, but the Enlightenment helped to produce Nazi Germany. It helped to produce these totalitarian Marxist states, which also thought they were scientific. And what all these have in common, the religious states, the religious totalitarian states, and the a-religious totalitarian states, is absolute certainty that they had the right set of answers. And it's understandable. I want to know what life is and how I should live my life. I understand this powerful yearning that people have and always have had for knowing what's going on, because being in a state of confusion is difficult. I actually like it, but I think I'm an oddball in this respect. Uh, and postmodernism is an expression. I see it as this very healthy and essential uh, response to the human yearning for certainty. The postmodernists, they go after science and say, well, are you really sure that these gene-based paradigms for understanding human behavior are really that successful? And the neuroscientific explanations of depression, really, like, show me your data. That's good. That sort of skepticism is healthy for science. Also, the postmodernists go after our moral systems, our value system that says capitalism is better than socialism, um, and they say, well, maybe not. Like, we should recognize that morality is just a projection of powerful people and institutions. It goes too far, postmodernism, because I think there are some. I don't believe in an absolute system of morality analogous to mathematical truths. There are philosophers who argue that, and I think that's a dangerous idea because it gets us back into this realm of possible zealotry and fanaticism. But I like to say, as an axiom, we might assume certain things, like, pleasure is better than pain. Even that is very complicated. That there's certain kinds of injustice that everybody recognizes are bad. When I look at war, I like to say, can we all agree that, like, dropping bombs on babies is bad? Does anybody object to that as like a not an absolute moral truth, but just as an axiom that we can build on? And then, of course, people immediately say, well, what if there's a terrorist and there's only like 3 babies in the vicinity? We can sacrifice those 3 babies for the terrorist. And I say, no, you can't do that. Let's just try to come up with a system of waging war or whatever, national security, that eliminates any justification for dropping a bomb on a baby. So postmodernism, it sort of points you in the right direction, but of course it's excessive in some ways. And I still think that to build a good society, we have to agree on certain axiomatic principles about what constitutes a good life, while at the same time acknowledging that there's no absolute rigid mathematical system of ethics.
It's funny
That's
how
my
easy
rant.
it is to accept these arguments like, oh, well, there's circumstances where what are you going to do? Like the Japanese, and you heard this one all the time, like if we'd had to invade the Japanese mainland, many more people would have died than with the atomic bombs. But most people don't realize there was actually a proposal on the table to, hey, we could just drop this nuke out in front of the harbor. And how many of those do you have to do before they get the message that this isn't going to work out for them if we keep going down this road? And it's like, I never even considered that was a possibility when you hear these stories on their face. So I think that's a
So
really interesting point, that you don't have to accept these zero-sum situations in all cases.
I have a colleague at Stevens who happens to be one of the foremost historians of nuclear weapons in the world. His name is Alex Wallerstein. He's a really brilliant guy, and he knows has written a lot about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and those decisions. Um, and I think it's pretty well accepted now that there were people who wanted to uh, drop the bombs on populated centers to see what would happen. Just dropping it over Tokyo Harbor wouldn't have been a good demonstration of the destruction, and they wanted it to be dramatic, not just for the sake of the Japanese, but for the sake of the Soviet Union as well. We were sending a message to those guys. So saving American lives, yeah, I'm sure that was part of the equation, but it certainly wasn't all of the thinking that went into that decision.
And so, in this landscape, we're all tasked with something that seems impossible, and it's kind of where we started, which is how do you figure out what is good and what is bad when you have, I think for good reason, like I have a really deep Chesterton's fence view of the world where I'm like, okay, there's this return to nature fallacy where people are like, we should just go back to living in little tribes. And I'm like, I guarantee you that there's a reason we don't anymore. Like those people made the decision not to do that. And you could say that like, well, they moved to the cities because they had to work in the factories and the evil capitalists made them leave. And I'm like, I think that there's stories of the Amish, of Pitcairn Island, of religious fundamentalist cults. Like these things all give you this glance into the horrors that happen into isolated rural communities.
Even the transcendental utopianists, right?
Yeah, like they weren't necessarily like violent and with a dark underbelly, but they did completely misunderstand the difficulty of working the land. And so every single transcendental utopian community that was like, let's live in the woods and return to nature, they're like, oh fuck, farming is so hard. Like we don't have any time to sit around and think. And so, okay, like we left every single place that we've ever been for good reason. We are here, we are stuck, we cannot go back to the past and be like, well, let's just pick up the thread and have it turn out differently. Because in some ways I am a fatalist. I'm like, we have a certain set of software that we run, and if you go back to that same place, you'll just end up here again. And so you have to figure out how to make it through. And so we, for good reason, removed the uniform location of trust from the church. We've said, okay, there's many world religions. We probably shouldn't have crusades anymore. We probably shouldn't have holy wars, because assuming that my religion is better than yours is a bad idea. Lots of lives lost, lots of suffering, lots of hypocrisy. Okay, move away from that. Now we move towards science as being the place where we place our value and trust. But then we have all of this like scientific racism, and we have eugenics, and we have the need to promote either the white bloodline or the proletarian bloodline or the farmer bloodline and get rid of like the landlords and the academics and the intellectuals. And you're like, well, that's a disaster. And so now we're standing here and we're like, okay, well, we've tried to place meaning in science and it didn't work. We tried to place meaning in the church and it didn't work. And yet we recognize that in order to survive, we have to have meaning. And so our task now is like, okay, where do we get it from? And
not only where do we get it, but where do we showcase it?
Ooh.
Like I feel like mythology, it's fundamental. I think people get the wrong idea about religion. Like obviously there's this state authoritarian aspect to it that wells up from time to time, but at its heart are these moral stories of what goes wrong when you act a certain way. I think the most well defined is the Roman mythology or the Greek mythology, which are one of my favorite things to do now is after I watch a movie or something, I'll just ask ChatGPT to give me a Greek myth that corresponds to the movie that I just watched. And I'm like, these are stories, like people have been telling these same stories forever, right? Because that's something we can't live without. The story is the fundamental piece of information by which, it's the fundamental mechanism by which we transmit information, especially cross-generationally. And so what are the stories that we tell? Like science it can't tell the kind of stories that we need in this department.
Okay, the horrifying thing about science is that the story that it tells is that the universe is vast and meaningless. Like that's, I think, the problem is that like the foundational story that it tells is just like, nothing matters. Sorry, guys. Heat death of the universe. Everybody's going to die a cold, empty, silent death. And nothing that you do will ever have any influence on anyone ever. And so you might as well just give up now.
Well, so the spin I put on it when I'm talking to my students about science and where it's brought us as an alternative to religion is it tells us that the origin of the universe was infinitely improbable. And there's no real good explanation for why the Big Bang happened in the first place, for the origin of space-time, and for the for this particular universe that we see with these particular laws of nature and these basic particles which allowed for our existence We have no good explanation for the origin of life. The people who have thought deepest and hardest about the origin of life, like Francis Crick, hardcore atheists, have concluded that, wow, really hard, really hard to know how life began on Earth. There are all these different theories. When there are a lot of theories, that means none of the theories is very good. I haven't seen anything. Crick told me this in the early 90s, and I haven't seen anything that's happened since then that makes origin of life look any less bizarre and mysterious. Then there's the origin of multicellular life. Then there's the origin of this and you and the origin of civilization. All these things. What's funny is that you get Richard Dawkins, somebody, he hates religion, hates spiritual explanations for things, and he constructs these very elaborate arguments to convince us that it's all inevitable. All this is inevitable. And natural selection is this universal force. It's probably working throughout the universe. And, then he's left science behind, and he's presenting a kind of spirituality himself to make us feel as though we were meant to be here. And what I say to my students is, no, that's just as bad an argument as saying that God created this. We don't know why we're here. It's a total mystery. It seems infinitely improbable that we exist, and yet here we are. How lucky can we get? Some of us luckier than others when it comes to individual circumstances. But the meaninglessness, the spin I put on it is that we have absolute freedom. No one is telling us what to do. There's no God that has a plan that we have to adhere to. We can make this shit up as we go. It's this extraordinary freedom that we have. That doesn't mean we turn into nihilistic assholes and play power games with each other. I mean, some people clearly do that, but I think many of us don't want to do that. We want to be kind to each other and then figure out how to have fun. And I think a lot of us manage to do that. So it's miraculous that we have this universe. That's the spin I put on it.
Isn't it ironic that guys like Dawkins will berate superstitious visions of ideas about God, but at the same time they'll reify these abstractions like evolution or electromagnetism or space-time and just even Newton's idea of a force that's causing things to happen. I mean, these are about as superstitious as it gets, right? But they do have this kind of cookbook feel to them that seems mechanistic at their heart. It's just fascinating. I just don't think that people can get away from thinking about this animation, right? This actual motivational structure upon which things happen. And to scientize it doesn't really make it go away. Nastia's got thoughts.
You have to have a metaphysics. Like we've talked about this before in the show, and I cast metaphysics as the set of rules by which your story works. It's the foundational principle of, okay, well, why do planets appear to orbit the sun? There's a metaphysics that says that it is a force called gravity that produces that. There is also the metaphysics that says, well, actually, they don't orbit around the sun, they orbit around the earth, and this is what that looks like. And so you can have all of these different metaphysics that match what you observe in the world, because there is this is the seed of the postmodern philosophy that's so powerful, is that there isn't a fundamental truth. Like, I think that if we were living on Jupiter, it would be possible to construct a model of the solar system where Jupiter was at the center as opposed to the Earth or to the sun, because all of your celestial observations would be from your vantage point. You would see different celestial mechanics, and they would still be able to be mathematically transformed into, okay, well, is it the sun, or is it the Earth, or is it Jupiter, or is it Mars, whatever. And you can't get to a place where you can say with certainty what it actually is, because these are mathematical transformations of some series of events. Okay, so the only thing that you have is your metaphysics. Your metaphysics says that it is better to place the sun at the center because that gives you something. And I think that there is a huge spiritual component to moving the Earth from the center of the solar system, because you actually can't, like, Tycho Brahe's system of the Earth at the center of the solar system fits observation. It just doesn't fit the sense that we have that there is a truer, more pure vantage point. And so at some point, what you're doing is you're arranging the story that you tell yourself about the world, because that story informs the way that you see mankind and humans and our position in the cosmos. And the great task is being able to develop a taste for what a good version of that story looks like, because you can't trust that Dawkins or anyone else is going to hand you some complete version of it that you can, like, stick in your pocket and, I guess, like, become an insufferable Reddit atheist for the next 20 years of your life. Like, there's a path, but it's not a very good path. And so the challenge that's in front of all of us is to figure out, like, what does it look like?
Yeah, I mean, I take refuge in agnosticism, and because I'm not satisfied by any of the religious explanations. Atheism seems contradictory to my sense that this is too dramatic to be here by happenstance. Life is exciting. It's this grand adventure. It's terrible. It's painful, but it's also got love and friendship and beauty and tennis and hockey and all sorts of good things. So, and it is infinitely improbable, but here it is. So, I guess I keep making a pitch for not going beyond what we know. We know some stuff, but there's a lot that we don't know. And when it comes to these absolute questions that we're talking about, the origin of the universe, the purpose of the universe, one of the things that I don't like about putting consciousness at the bottom of things, or even some kind of dualism or panpsychism, sort of elevating consciousness into something that's not an epiphenomenon, but was there from the start, was sort of glimmering in the Big Bang itself, is that, to me, it's a projecting a human quality into the universe. And that seems to be going back to these old religious narcissistic ideas that all this is about us. Maybe it is all about us, but I think it's healthier for us to take seriously the possibility that it's not all about us, that we just happen to be here. We're along for the ride. We don't know how much longer we're going to last. Right now, at this particular point in history, things look a little scary. It's kind of perilous. Are we going to make it through this next period? I certainly hope so, and I have a deep faith that we will, but it is just a faith. And I guess what I'm talking about is, I guess I'm advocating a resistance to absolute answers, which has just gotten us in trouble in the past, and a willingness to be in a state of doubt and uncertainty. As I said, to me, that's like a career path. So I understand if other people don't find it as appealing, but maybe they could try it.
Do you think that if all of this progress unfolds and we do learn how to be happier, more fulfilled, less killing of each other, less poverty, less privation, if there actually is an arc towards something approximating good, wouldn't that be, in some sense, a proof of God? Like wouldn't that demonstrate that there is a, like, I have a hard time getting over the fact that good and God are one O away from each other. Right? It's a very similar concept in its best case. It's like the highest ideal of what is good. And if we are manifesting that and making that manifest, doesn't that make us as entities expressions of that good on balance? if there is actually a trajectory towards the better, and in some sense doesn't, like you said in your essay, doesn't that essentially make us manifestations of that good, of that God, if you will, right?
Yeah, I have a. Do you know Robert Wright? Do you know his work?
I don't think
He's
so.
he started out as a science journalist, and now he's kind of a mega pundit. He wrote a book called The Moral Animal that was a popularization of evolutionary psychology, except it was actually more rigorous than most of the works written by the scientists.
He got
Um,
really into Buddhism, right?
yes, and his last book was a bestseller called Why Buddhism is True. But he wrote two books. One was called Non-Zero, about the growth of non-zero sum interactions, altruism and cooperation, symbiosis throughout evolution, and especially manifested in modern civilization. It came out right before 9/11, but still, it's a brilliant book. And then he also wrote a book called The Evolution of God. Um, Bob's two big belief systems are evolution and or the two fundamental principles of his thinking are evolution and God, and so he likes to combine them into one, and then arguing that cooperation and non-zero sum interactions are growing through evolution. He hints, because he's a very smart guy and he doesn't want to sound too religious, but he's definitely in the ballpark of saying that there is that non-zero sum in interactions and evolution are manifesting some kind of divine plan. And I like it. I want to believe in it. I just don't, because I think that those sorts of ideas are dangerous. We can pat ourselves on the back, but it's intriguing. I'll grant you that.
And yet, even though there has to be some organizing principle. Like I always think about do you know the slime mold, the slime mold, Dictostelium discoideum, I think it's called. And
Bob Wright has written about that.
Okay, because I think that this is a perfect example, right? You have these individual amoebas that are living in a dish, they run out of food, and the signal goes out that it's time to slug, and they come together to form this slug, and the slug is now this entity that moves around the plate until it finds the right place to send up a stalk. The stalk is full of spores, the spores disperse, and the entire cycle begins again.
SpaceX.
Exactly. It's very panspermic. It's very the cycles of civilization. I'm sure that there's some aspects of Vedic cosmology in there. Even the Big Bang, right? Because like an individual spore landing on a new plate is in some ways a Big Bang. Okay. That's an insane life cycle. So, and if you think about it, it's a life cycle that suggests that there is a time for individualistic operation, and there is a time for communal operation, and that these things, if programmed somehow into the genes of the organism, allow the organism to survive really trying times. And there is also a theory about the substance of the genome, which says that the reason that we have so much excess material that doesn't appear to be doing anything is that it's stuff that's useful under other conditions. Like everybody that we look at right now has a certain gene expression profile because everybody lives in relatively similar conditions. But if you suddenly have a nuclear winter, or if you suddenly have a 100-year drought, if you suddenly have an ice age comes, then all of these things get reawakened and the species behaves differently. And I'm like, it seems entirely plausible that there is a moment where density and technology and philosophy all hits this tremulous maximum point where we actually shift the way that we live. And I can't tell if it's conscious or unconscious. Like if it's something that's reawakening in our genetic programming, Are we making the conscious choice, or are we just being bathed in our environment of microplastics and algorithms that induces us to behave differently? Like, I
Are you
quite
going to
tell.
invent a new age religion to solve this problem for us?
I think that plenty of people have. I think,
I
like,
think you just made it conscious by talking about it there.
it's already happening. You see it out in the world. It's like everybody's afraid of overpopulation, but birth rates are going down everywhere. What do you think that is?
Yeah.
You think that we're just gonna like crash? Like the diagrams that you see, people are like, "Well, we're just gonna crash to zero," and I'm like, "Are you stupid? It's like, do you not understand how this works?"
So one thing that I'm puzzled by is, there are some of these cosmic models of existence that are cyclic.
Unknown caller.
And so, things, novelty emerges in unexpected ways. So we started this conversation where with a discussion of progress. I believe in progress. I believe there's a direction to history. You pull back, and are we just in the upswing of a cycle? And inevitably there will be a collapse. And if you pull way back, you see that it's just cycle after cycle, some kind of Hindu model where it's birth and death over and over again, an infinite number of times. And I'm sort of, this is related to heat death and what's going to happen to this universe and all that. So I sort of, I have different metaphysics or I don't know, moral systems for different time scales. I've got this little life to live. And for my little life, I don't need those infinite cyclic models of cosmic birth and destruction. That might be comforting to some people. It's not comforting to me. So I want to believe that we are going in some direction. Whether or not that has anything to do with a divine plan, I have no idea. But I see that direction in human history. I told you I've seen it in my own little tiny lifespan. I've seen moral progress in my own country. And I'm hoping we continue to see it, and that we're not, in some ways, sort of blind as the amoebas that are forming the slime mold and going through these cycles. We look kind of blind right now, but I think this maybe we're passing through a period where the darkness is going to wake us up and make us more aware and conscious and determined to get past this period and create a better future. Although that is such a cliched liberal progressive response to Trump's election, but it's that sort of stuff that I cling to get through this bad time.
I mean, I think that the election is really weird for me because I'm really alarmed that there isn't a party that is actually representative of the sanctity of individual choice. Do you know what I mean by that?
You're not just talking about abortion. You're talking about choice in general.
Well, I'm like
just rights to your body in general, like the ability to put whatever you want or not in your body, for instance, is interesting. There's no party. Like both parties seem to prefer their own version of what you can do with your body.
And